discussing the IMF and its role in fostering globalization. I will highlight a couple of key examples that illustrate the IMF's involvement in the global economy, using concepts from the text to expand on certain topics. First, let's take a look at some of the presentation highlights. I will discuss the organization's modus operandi, the historical outline and origins, how they are funded, and what programs they are involved in, followed by the organizational structure and governance of the IMF. I will also discuss what kind of issues the IMF helps solve, including the recent research findings on fossil fuel subsidies. I will make linkages to globalization along the way before capping the presentation off with a brief summary. Q&A can be done through the forum. The IMF, also known as the Fund, was conceived at a UN conference in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in July 1944. The 44 countries at that conference sought to build a framework for economic cooperation to avoid a repetition of the competitive devaluations that had contributed to the Great Depression of the 1930s. I found this interesting because we just discussed how trade protectionism and tariff escalation as a policy can be detrimental to the world economy. Professor Reed posted the circle graphic that illustrated how the economy shrank during the years preceding and during the Great Depression. The emergence of the IMF as an organization was a direct result of economies creating trade barriers. Of course, we know that trade declined as a result. Employment and living standards also degraded. The founders' general intent at the time was to oversee the international monetary system in an effort to prevent this from happening again. The IMF officially began operating March 1st, 1947, and France became the first country to borrow from them. I would be remiss not to mention the founding fathers of the IMF, as they became major contributors to the world of economics. John Maynard Keynes and Harry Dexter were the founding fathers of both the IMF and the World Bank. Keynes may sound familiar, as his ideas became the framework of Keynesian economics, which is a school of thought that was employed by Western industrialized countries post-World War II. The IMF's primary purpose is to ensure the stability of the international monetary system, the system of exchange rates and international payments that enables countries and their citizens to transact with each other. The fund's mandate was updated in 2012 to include all macroeconomic and financial sector issues that bear on global stability. They do this through a process called surveillance, which I will discuss later. They promote international monetary cooperation, facilitate the expansion and balanced growth of international trade, promote exchange stability, they assist in the establishment of a multilateral system of payments, and they make resources available to members experiencing balance of payment difficulties. Everything I've researched has indicated that the IMF makes a genuine effort of bringing developing countries up to speed by dismantling barriers, lending at favorable rates, and including them in the global economic conversation. That is basically the definition of globalization, and their efforts speak for themselves. They also conduct surveillance, and this can be confusing because it doesn't mean surveillance in a traditional sense. Member states that join make a commitment to uphold and execute economic policy that is conducive to free market trade and economic growth. The IMF will also analyze financial and economic data of each member state through consultations where they make recommendations about policies that may need some improvement. They also conduct surveillance at the regional and global level, focusing on economic trends and developments in public finance and currency unions. Let's go over the organizational structure and governance. The IMF is currently headquartered in Washington, D.C. and consists of 188 member nations as of 2015. The highest decision-making group in the IMF is the Board of Governors. It makes important decisions such as approving quota increases, which will be discussed shortly. The Executive Board reports directly to the Board of Governors, and then there are several departments below that, such as the Communications Department and the Human Resources Department. Take a look at the latest organizational chart on the right here. Essentially, the IMF operates as a bank, one that operates for the central banks of each member state. One major question that typically arises is, how is the IMF funded? It's actually explained in our text in chapter 7 if you wanted to read about it in more detail. The funds are derived from two major sources, quotas and loans. They are also one of the world's largest holders of gold. Quotas are essentially a subscription fee paid by each member nation to the IMF, and this generates most of their income. The fees are determined by the economic and financial impact that the member nation has on the world economy. This seems to be an arbitrary measure that is designated by the Board of Governors. IMF also finances their operations with debt, primarily in the form of loans from member nations, such as a line of credit with Saudi Arabia. The way the IMF helps countries design macroeconomic policy has a key impact on growth and on reducing poverty and inequality. This type of activity and involvement facilitates greater interdependence between nations, allowing globalization to flourish. Similar to the WTO, the IMF is interested in minimizing trade barriers and increasing financial and trade liberalization. The IMF sets specific growth rates for developing nations based on what it regards as achievable. It also determines the potential impact of large growth-oriented projects and possible trade-offs between growth and inflation, all in an effort to diminish inequality and improve trade conditions. A study by Oxfam demonstrated that the real GDP growth increased sharply in IMF program nations between 2001 and 2008, after the introduction of IMF's Poverty Reduction and Growth Facility program, although it was only slightly higher in comparison to non-participating nations. This is a perfect example of the IMF fostering globalization, as it's directly facilitating the improvement of economic conditions in emerging nations, setting the framework for increased trade between nations, and building new, mutually beneficial connections. This real GDP growth that I mentioned has since slowed since the last global economic crisis and is now below levels in 9 non-IMF program countries. The IMF and independent assessments have indicated that IMF programs have also been associated with poverty reduction. Poverty has been reduced twice as quickly in IMF program nations compared to non-program nations, to the tune of 20%. Among other vital projects, the IMF has recently studied the effects of subsidies for the global fossil fuel industry and its impediment on renewable energy growth. They discovered that putting a stop to subsidies for fossil fuels such as gas or coal would cut global emissions by 20%. The study attributes an estimated true cost of $5.2 trillion in fossil fuels, which represents 6.5% of the global GDP. This true cost is representative of the subsidies plus associated health and mortality implications of air pollution derived from fossil fuels. The IMF argues that fossil fuel subsidies typically line the pockets of the wealthy, while the poorest countries receive little. This call for global change is aimed at dismantling the fossil fuel industry that is propped up by massive subsidies. This is actually eerily similar to the Boeing and Airbus example discussed in class and in the text. Boeing lodged a complaint about Airbus because they felt that the subsidies European governments provided them gave them an unfair competitive advantage. The interesting element of the research is that it highlights a very real climate threat, but it also aligns with their mandate of trade liberalization that I spoke about earlier. So that means it benefits the environment while fostering globalization by reducing the incessant dependence on dirty energy and suppressing emerging renewable energy markets. Let's recap the high points of the presentation. The IMF was officially founded in 1944. They are funded primarily by quotas and loans. They are one of the world's largest holders of gold. The IMF's primary purpose is to ensure the stability of the international monetary system, the system of exchange rates and international payments that enables countries and their citizens to transact with each other. It lends money, promotes international cooperation, influences national economic policy, conducts surveillance or research, and seeks to improve international economic conditions. They foster globalization by encouraging developing nations to embrace trade liberalization and help finance certain projects. IMF research has brought much needed attention to the climate change debate and the economic implications of massive fossil fuel subsidies, which has stunted growth in the renewable energy industry. In sum, the IMF is a vital global contributor to economic development.